The first thing I'm going to talk about is this is a wash brush, is something that's unique about wash brushes like this. And when I speak of Callia specifically, something that's unique about Callia's flats and wash brushes may not be exactly the same sort of the way that a flat and a wash brush is composed in a different brush line. So I'm speaking very specifically kind of to how we've made these brushes here. This wash brush here has etched synthetic. And what that means is that every single strand of synthetic has a slightly etched effect to the filament so that when you load it in water, it soaks the water up, holds it kind of in the center or the belly area of the brush, and then releases it more gradually than a traditional synthetic would, which makes the flats and the wash brushes in this line fairly unique. The other thing, and this is great to kind of check out any brush line, that you'll see sometimes in a flat brush is that it curves inward like this. So you can kind of tell it's kind of coming in towards the center. What's good about that is it's what's called interlocked. In modern times, interlocked means we've heat set it to hold this shape. That's a really important thing because what that means is that as the brush is used, the shape continues to return back because it's been forced by heat to stay in that shape in that direction. So when you're looking at flats and wash brushes, you want to make sure you're looking for brushes that go inward as opposed to kind of coming outward or being completely flat like this, because that means they're not necessarily interlocked. So that's a little tidbit on some flat brushes, and this is called a cultured synthetic. You can kind of tell by what looks like a little bit of graininess, but it's actually not grainy. It comes out really, really smooth and really beautifully and still has a great sharp edge. And a nice sharp edge here as well. So you can get lots of different effects, and we'll go over some of those later on. Still hearing me okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you. So this brush here is called a smooth synthetic. I'm just gonna wet it for a minute. And what's neat about this brush is that it does not have etched pockets. We did the opposite thing with it. I'm gonna hold it over white so that you can see it a little bit. We did the opposite with it. So we made sure that these filaments were completely smooth. And what that means is that as you're painting, the water in the paint, and these are a fine round, they're called, they're beautiful for watercolor. The paint and water flows evenly off the tip of the brush and really smoothly and really fluidly. So this smooth synthetic, which is often found in rounds or mixed media brushes that have a very fine tip, is really beautiful for smooth, fine techniques. Then we have a bristle. And in our case, Callia is made with 100% synthetics. We don't use any animal hair. We don't use any animal glues or any animal byproducts in the making of our brushes because we're very much focused on ensuring that we stay cruelty-free. So we made a synthetic bristle. But what we did with our synthetic bristle, and the difference and the neat thing, this has still got sizing in it. You probably can't see it, but it's actually releasing little fluffs. When you get a new brush, I forgot to mention that that you want to wash them out before you use them the first time because there's like a sugar water sizing in them. So this bristle synthetic here is amazing because the tips of each individual bristle are actually like a split end. They're flagged, it's called, or they're split, so that it holds more paint and more water. They make amazing dry brush brushes for acrylic and oil. They also do really cool things in watercolor. And we'll talk about changing mediums in just a second. So this synthetic bristle, which you can see in dry brushes, and it doesn't just have to be Callia, it can be any line. You'll notice sometimes they have these kind of bristle effects, or it's a bristle brush in general. They're stiffer and firmer. They have greater snap, so they're gonna hold their shape much stronger than another brush would. And they're really great for things like dry brushing, rouging, and in today's case, actually, we're going to show you some cool stuff with trees with these mop brushes. The softest, we make probably one of the softest mops out there. And one of the reasons is that every single filament on a mop brush is crimped. It always reminds me of my 80s hairstyles. I don't know if any of you remember that, but I'm just going to draw a little picture here. Every filament does this. And then in addition to them all being crimped and heat set, which is important, they're also tapered. So you can see how there's a gradual taper to the end. So you have this incredibly soft finish at the ends. and you have lots of density in the middle of the brush. Mop brushes can be found in lots of different brush lines and in lots of different shapes. So you'll notice this one has much less give. So this springs a lot more. This does not. It's got much less give, which gives you lots of control and blends smaller, tinier, more compact areas. And here's another example of a little mop. Brand new. And it's much more similar to this shape here, but smaller for smaller areas. And we're actually gonna, I use these in oil a lot to blend, but I'm gonna show you watercolor trees with this guy today that are really easy and really fun to paint. Those are kind of your 4 or 5 different filament types. I think I covered 4 today. And it's important when you're looking, and let's just talk about different mediums. This is a quote unquote mixed media brush line, which means you could use it for any medium, oil, acrylic, or watercolor. But depending on the shape and the type of bristle, you may find it's more suited for one medium over the other one. So for example, this has much more flex to it. It bends much easier. This is your fine round. I don't particularly like painting with this in oil because it's got too much bend for me. I like a little bit more control with shorter bristles, but that's actually a personal preference. An oil painter may find that they love this for what they're doing. However, fine rounds often sell to watercolorists because the way the water flows off that super gradual taper is so fine and so beautiful that they get really, really great detail lines with it. So the point is, when you see brushes, most modern brush lines today will tell you that they're good for one medium or the other. It's a suggestion. If they're a quality brush and they have great glue right here where the brush meets the ferrule, you're going to find that they could be used for oil, they could be used for acrylic, or they could be used for watercolor, depending on your specific technique. I will suggest, though, that once you use a brush for a specific medium, you don't want to switch back and forth. So I have a set of mops for oil and a set of mops for watercolor, and I have 2 different sets. Because if you're painting in oil and you use a turpentine base, it's going to repel the water in watercolor. So that's the only kind of caveat I would say to mixing mediums. Once you've chosen one for a brush, you kind of want to stick with it. And I'm going to pause there because I can't see anything. So I'm just going to ask if there's any questions and hold my ear up to the phone to hear them.
So there's a question about the name of the line. Are they all Callia brushes,
Yeah.
or is there names for the lines?
So this brush line here is Callia. Originally, it was actually called Callia, which is an old word way back in the day that was derived from a Greek word that meant beautiful. So Callia makes over now 144 different shapes and sizes, but we actually haven't. There's about 20 new shapes we haven't even released yet. The great thing about being a little wee company like we are is we tend to kind of, and being an artist who owns the company, I get really excited. I try a new technique and I say, oh my goodness, I need a brush now for that. And I make a brush. So we're able to be really flexible and kind of do lots of new exciting things. In 6 months, for example, we launch a whole new set of brush sets or, a new kind of dry brush. So right now we have about 140 different shapes and sizes, all falling under the Callia line. We do have other brush lines that are not fully officially released yet. One is a very heavy bodied bristle brush for oil and acrylic, but it's not quite fully in the market yet because we're just not quite ready to go there. Callia has kept us honestly so busy that that our little baby company, now has 3 of us working pretty much all the time, keeping it going. So Callia is the main name. Callia by Willow Wolfe is kind of what you'll see. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so that's a brief intro to kind of brushes and a little bit about brushes themselves. And I will talk again about that sizing in the brushes. So I'm going to bring some water over here. And this is one, for example, that has lots of sizing in it. Let me find these dry brushes. You'll actually see it actually isn't moving when I push up against it. So you don't want to ruin the brush. You want to wash it out to get that sizing out of there. And it actually sometimes feels a little bit sticky, and it really is kind of like a sugar water. And then just let the brush dry. So that's how you want to kind of prime a brush to get started. And then what we're going to do, and I'm just going to show you what does that brush do here. Opus now has this, I believe, on the category page for Callia. And what it is it's an actual guide that shows you some different techniques that you can use for a variety of brushes that are out there. Clouds, trees, bushes, fur, feathers, and tiny details. And again, these are suggestions. What I love about artists is that they will often email me and say, hey, did you know that your mop brushes are the best blending brushes I've ever used for alla prima oil in giant florals? And I'll go, oh my goodness, I had no idea. So these are ideas, but it's really you guys who kind of create the uses for a lot of what we make as far as a brush. It's really a back and forth learning experience. So I'm going to just move some stuff. And what I do want to mention as I talk about different brushes and whatnot is that what Opus is carrying, and these are again suggestions, is a lot of our brush sets. So one thing we did with our brush sets was say, what are the most common shapes and sizes for different techniques? So you'll see the mixed media fine round brush set. This is probably our best seller to watercolor artists, along with this one here, which is it's kind of a generic watercolor rounds brush set. So both of these right here are phenomenal for watercolor. And we built the sets to work with a variety of watercolor techniques in one set. We have a mini detail set. And then we also have, this is my #1 set right here for oil painting. And I paint with Cobra water mixable oil. This is a blending set. And this will paint almost anything that I paint in oil: animals, fur, feathers, flowers, even some landscapes. So a lot of these sets are really great because they give you a good introduction to a variety of techniques, including starter sets that give you an angle, a flat, a round, and a liner, just to sort of test things out and get started. Or maybe you want to do a few basic techniques with a set. So they're built to kind of provide opportunity within that set in itself. Now let's get started painting. So we're going to actually do some watercolor techniques today. And I think what we'll start with is my angle shader. And I'm just going to move a few things over here. It's a new angle shader, brand new. So I'm going to wet it first. And I'm using watercolor. And then I'm going to blot it on paper towel. Let me make sure you can see everything. And I think I've got some dry watercolor and some wet watercolor here. So these I just put out. This is sap green. And I'm going to get it wet and I'm going to move it over here. So the unique thing with an angle shader is what we call the toe. And the toe is this little part here. And the toe is amazing for giving us kind of very specific outputs, we call it. So for example, if I want to make sure that I do a leaf with a fine edge, I can use that toe to create really, really, really specific control in a set area. And I can't turn my project right now, so it's hard for me to kind of show you what the other side of this would look like. It's going to look kind of backwards. But I'm just going to fill this in and you can kind of get an idea. The other benefit of an angle shader is it's built quite a bit like a wash brush, the rest of it. So we have that toe for specific spots, but then the rest acts as a really beautiful wash brush and fills in areas really smoothly with a nice, solid, beautiful wash in the middle of it. And here's what I use an angle shader for most: floating. So floating is a term that I learned when I painted in acrylic 25 years ago, and it was for shading and highlighting. And I use it in watercolor now that I paint in watercolor a lot. So to float, I use more often an angle shader than any other brush. I dip it in clean water and I blot to take off the excess. And then I dip the toe in the brush in the color that I want. And it's got to be wet. So my watercolor is already starting to dry. And I blend it on the palette. And the cool thing with floating is that what I'm doing with blending right now is as I stroke, it's moving that color from the darkest part of the toe towards the middle part of the brush. So when I go onto a surface, I have a gradation of color here without having to blend on the watercolor paper itself. It's already been pre-blended in this area. So you can kind of see how you would be able to, whether you're painting a round ball and you want to come around in a circle and you need a shadow in there. And then I can kind of move this color or walk it in. Floating is one of my favorite techniques for shading. I use it more in shading than highlighting. And the toe of this angle is incredible for giving you that kind of control in the area that you want to make sure that the color is placed in. It also gives you a very specific place to pick that color up on with that toe. Now you can float with a wash brush and a flat brush. You just use the corner of the brush, but I find that the angle gives me that very specific way to figure out where I want that shadow to start. And that's our angle. I'm going to stop there for a second and just make sure that we're okay technically, and that anyone who has any questions can ask them.
So there don't seem to be any in the chat box right now, although feel free to enter them, everybody. We love hearing your questions.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll keep going. So what I want to do now, I'm going to set the angle brush aside, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our wash brush. So again, I mentioned to you that the wash brush is obviously by the name, great for washes. It's also great for base coating large areas. It makes a great varnish brush. It makes a great floating brush for larger areas. And so just to give you kind of an application for that, I'm first going to show you when we load this brush, and it's new. So I'm going to clean out the sizing. And here's a couple interesting things about a Callia flat brush. And all our flats and washes are made similarly. Look how fine and sharp that chisel edge is. That's interlocking, and that's also just really, our brush makers who make these brushes focus really hard on making sure that we have a sharp edge on our brushes. Some artists, depending on what they're doing, and not all of our brushes have a sharp edge, but our flats and our washes do, so that when we want that line to be specific, we have that capability. And that requires great brush making skill. The other thing you'll notice is the different colors in here. That in this case, there are 5 different diameters of filament of different round synthetic fibers that make up this brush. And the number of diameters of filaments help to give variation, I'm not sure I'm saying this correctly, throughout the brush. So again, the water and the paint distributes really beautifully and really evenly. So multi-diameter filaments interlocking makes an incredible brush that lasts a long time. And of course, making sure that it's crimped properly and that it's glued far enough down into where these filaments meet the ferrule that you're not going to lose shape, and filaments and hairs aren't going to fall out. So our flat brushes and our wash brushes are great for that. When you're doing a wash, you're going to dip the brush in water, and I'm going to pick some dry watercolor here. I'm going to tell an awesome story about Opus. I was filming our new beginner watercolor class last weekend, and I was at the lake and I ran out of paint, and I needed, I used Van Gogh watercolor, and I needed it in a few days. And I phoned Panicked, and they went and picked the order right away and got it to me so that I could finish filming my class. But just amazing customer service. So this Quinacridone Rose is one of my favorite colors. And I'm just getting lots of it kind of wet here on the palette. And you'll notice, see how it's creeping up the brush? So that's interesting because what it's doing is it's filling all those little pockets, and I'm getting lots and lots of paint in that brush. And I want to make sure I can angle this so you can see it. So I'm just going to do a little wash here. I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. So, and that's barely even pressing. And if I were to put pressure on the brush, more paint is still flowing from where it had crept up into the middle of the bristles down into the tip of the brush. So incredible color holding capacity. And with a wash brush, you have the option of doing things like washes, just like this, but there's also lots of other techniques. So let's rinse this out. And what I want to show with a good wash, or a good, and if any flat brush is the same, is that if I want a sharp line, I just hold the brush straight up and down. So there's two primary holds in watercolor. There's a vertical hold, which is almost straight up and down. And there's a horizontal hold. I'm having trouble getting the right angle, but you get the idea. So with a sharp chisel edge on a wash brush, you're going to be able to get nice sharp lines. This is a more horizontal hold, and this is again your vertical hold. So a good wash does not just have to wash. A good wash brush can coat areas in. It can do fine lines, and it can also float large areas. So I'm going to grab, I don't think this is wet. No, so let's activate that, we'll call it. Wet the brush. And you can float or create, and we'll just say I'm creating imaginary fluffy little clouds. And you'll see you have a nice gradation of darker color to lighter color if you float it properly. And it doesn't have to go to absolutely nothing at the edge, just as long as you've got kind of a darker variation and a lighter variation flowing from there. So there's a little bit of information on your wash brushes and your flat shaped brushes. Very similar, they do very similar things. And another flat shape, and so let's just talk about flat shapes versus round shapes. A flat shape indicates that you have a flat edge when you're on the side of the brush. So you might not think of this of a filbert as a flat shape because it's got a rounded oval at the tip, but because it creates a chisel edge, it is considered part of the flat shape family. Filberts are an amazing floral painting brush. They give great shape and great dimension. So I'm going to just make sure I have enough Quin Rose here. And so when we're working with our Filbert, you have the ability to kind of create lots of different rounded shapes. In addition, if you just wanted to kind of pull down, if you curve the brush, this is a very, very lazy daisy, by the way. You can actually come in and create rows and rows of shaped petals. So the Filbert is probably one of my favorite floral brushes because of that ability to create shape in such a quick manner. So I'm just going to show you what we call a basic comma stroke. So you can see the great level of control you have with the rounded end. And then when you lift, I call it airplaning, and you airplane off the surface, you get that super fine tip to it. So that's what gives you some of that ability to create that fatter edge there, and then to come down into a pointed finish at the bottom. Filberts are, like I say, one of my favorite floral brushes, and they create a gorgeous rounded edge and that fine, fine bottom at the bottom of it at this finish here. So there's an example of your Filbert. I'm just going to pause for questions.
This is a lot of fun, Willow.
Okay. I wish I could see faces.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder how many people out there are painting along right now.
I don't know, but I hope they're playing like mad and doing lots of fun, cool things. And it would be nice one day we should do a back and forth where we can actually spotlight some people and they can show some stuff and we can play around together. Okay, more shapes. So let's talk a little bit more about shapes. We've done a little bit about the angle, the Filbert, the wash brush. I'm going to move into rounds now. So depending on the medium that you're working in, rounds are probably one of the most popular brushes. And they're probably one of my, again, the Filbert and the round are my two floral brushes for watercolor. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you those two rounds I briefly mentioned, the fine round and then a traditional round. And I get asked this question a lot. What's the difference? These are the same size, two number 8s. This one is not broken in yet, so I'm just going to very gently take the sizing out. So what we have here is, I'm just flicking them out to make sure that we show the belly. The interesting thing with a fine round is that absolutely fine taper on the end that comes to an extreme point. The round, the traditional round, has a fuller, fatter belly in the middle of it that holds actually more water and paint than the fine round does, but a fine, much more kind of, trying to think of the word, quick taper at the end. So it's still got a fine point at the end, but it happens really fast. It's not such a gradual taper. So that means a couple different things. The regular round is going to hold more paint and water for wider, fuller strokes, and it's going to still be able to finish in a fine point, but that fine point isn't going to drag as long of a line as a fine round will. The fine round is a favorite of watercolorists because they can control small, tiny detail areas with great precision using the fine round. And don't get me wrong, it still holds lots of water in the belly, just not quite as much and as full as a traditional round. These are both synthetics. My passion point is to try at some point in our lives to stop using natural hair brushes because of the harm that are done to animals in the production of natural hair. And there's a couple of really amazing things in synthetics that are happening. One of them is that the new ways of modifying synthetics, things like etching, different taper ratios, are allowing us to get very similar effects to natural hair with a synthetic hair. The other great thing about synthetic is that they're less expensive. So beginners can start painting and still have beautiful results with beautiful brushes without having to spend $30, $40 to $120 on a natural hair brush. And the other amazing thing is that they also last longer than a synthetic hair because the hair doesn't break, or than a natural hair, because natural hair breaks and snaps like our human hair does. We get split ends, whereas synthetic hair holds that filament shape much better and much longer. So synthetics are becoming kind of the new way of painting, and I'm really, really excited to see that. But let's just get started. So I think I'm going to start with the fine round first. And we're going to use some of this Quin Rose. I'm obsessed with pinks lately. What you want to make sure is I usually don't have my water cup this full. When you do, you're often going to get a pool of water at the ferrule, and you may be surprised while you're painting because it'll continue to drip down the brush itself. So you want to make sure you don't have that big drip coming out. I'm going to load, wipe off the excess, make sure I have enough Quin Rose, and you'll see how fine that point stays. So I'm going to touch here. It's just like a liner brush. And look how dramatic, and it is quite a dramatic effect that you have. And the other thing with that fine taper that you have on this brush is that that kind of effect, like a small liner brush, can go for a really, really long time.
On that circle chair.
Okay. Was there a question?
I believe just someone came off mute there.
Oh, okay, no problem.
There is a question in here. What brand of paints are you using today?
So these are Van Gogh watercolor paint made by Royal Talons. Really beautiful pigment quality, affordable. I think I've got a little tub of them here. I use a split primary palette, so you can kind of see that here. And what that means is that I have two reds. I have Quin Rose, Pyro Red Light. So I have an orangey red and I have a cooler red. I have two blues. There's my red, I think. I don't know where my, oh, and there's my cool red. So little tiny tubes of watercolor. I like the tubes usually better than the pans, although I do use watercolor pans all the time. But I like to be able to just kind of squeeze it out and have it be completely wet and ready to go right away. And Van Gogh is definitely probably my favorite brand for both my personal use and for teaching, because they have such a range of color that are affordable for artists, and they're incredibly great quality color. And you can see just how rich and beautiful that is. And as, like I mentioned, we've been working on this new watercolor class, and choosing which colors we were using was really important. because I didn't want students to have to buy more than 6 to 8 colors, preferably only 6 if necessary. So we had to have high enough quality colors that they could mix anything from those 6 colors beautifully with great results. And Van Gogh does the job. The other colors I have here, so I'll just go back: Quin Rose, Pyro Red Light, Phthalo Blue, Ultramarine Blue, Yellow Medium, no, Yellow Light, Lemon Yellow Light. And normally I don't use yellow ochre in a split primary palette, but I like how it tones the color down a little bit. So I was using yellow ochre here. And then I have sap green and olive green because I call them convenience colors. We could mix them, but they're nice to just squeeze out and have them ready to go. The other great thing about watercolor is that you really look how tiny this is. If I'm traveling and I want to paint, I really just have to take a few little colors and some water to go and be able to paint whatever I want. So this Quin Rose, again, so let's just show you that full bodied effect that you get with a fine round. So here again, so there's your vertical hold, which is how you're going to get really fine lines. And here's your horizontal hold. Look at all that color coming out. So a really versatile, amazing brush. And of course, you want to be using good quality color. I'm just dropping down in value by adding more water. So there's your fine round. And then let's just take a look at our traditional round. Much fuller belly. So you can still get fine points, but they're not going to go as long. And because you've got such a short little pointed area, you kind of have to have more control here in the way that you're holding the brush. I don't mind that. And honestly, a lot of my watercolor students prefer the fine round when they're doing work like this. I actually prefer the traditional round. It's really just personal preference. And the reason I prefer the traditional round is that when I paint florals, I have just this amazing full belly that's going to give me those full kind of floral effects with just a stroke. So again, that's that comma stroke that I mentioned. It's like the alphabet of painting. I would practice commas all day long. And you wouldn't necessarily apply them that way, but you kind of get how that's going to develop that hand-eye control. Really, really pressure that brush. Lift, lift, lift. And I'm really showing you how much water is coming out of here. And then you can still lift to that fine, fine taper. So the real big difference when you're painting is you're going to have probably the ability to have longer, fine lines with the fine round. And with the full-bellied round, the traditional round brush, you're going to get those wider, full-bellied strokes that you can use for big, loose florals in watercolor. And that vertical versus horizontal hold is really important. So I'm just going to show you again. The vertical hold, let's do a leaf here. And my two convenience greens, I call them, the ones I kind of just have on hand all the time, are my sap green and my olive green. So as I look at a leaf, we're kind of making a little start, press, lift, and drag. So that's that comma stroke where you airplane off the surface as if you're going to fly away. And then the other side, press, lift, and drag. And so your basic leaf, and you don't want to over control it. I love to leave negative space in the middle. So for example, I might just leave kind of a little bit of space without filling it all in. And you can come straight up and down. So I could go touch, press, lift, and drag. And I'm one of those artists who likes to let the color do what it wants to do. So oftentimes we look at the rules or what we think are the rules and we say, maybe the shadow should be at the bottom. When I paint watercolor, I don't follow that. I just kind of let it go and let it do what it wants. So the other thing we can do is extend that with a round that holds lots and lots of water. And there's just a single leaf. You don't have to do two sides to a leaf. You could just have a series of little leaves kind of coming through, smaller ones coming out from behind a flower. So the traditional round for watercolor especially is an incredible brush. And you can paint anything: skies, seascapes, buildings, landscapes, flowers, leaves, anything you want in the world. Both the fine round and the round are great brushes. It just depends on kind of what effect and what you're trying to do. Questions?
I'm not seeing any currently in the chat, Willow.
Okay, cool. All right, so we've talked a little bit about your traditional rounds and your traditional flats and angles and filberts and things like that. Let's talk about the kind of specialty shapes that we all look at and see out there and think, what is that actually made for, and why do I want it? And if you're me, I want all brushes. I have bins and bins of brushes that I play with all the time. And what's really great to understand and to know is kind of the capability of that brush. But more than that, it's how do I use it? What pressure do I use? What is it best for? And then once you kind of have an idea of its intended purpose, it's really easy to kind of break that rule and say, that's a great intended purpose, but I think it works really cool for this or for that. So we're going to start with the Filbert grainer, Philbert Comb, Rake. So in any brand of brushes, you'll see a different name for this, but really what it is in our case, it's a Filbert comb. Other brands might call it a rake, a comb, a grainer is another name for it. What it is it's a brush where there's cuts out of it. So you end up with, it's like a Filbert shape. I use a Filbert comb. You can also use a flat one are out there. So it's cut. So you have spaces between the sets of bristles. And ours is actually made so that it's cut probably a little bit more than a lot of the ones you'll see out there. And I'm just going to get it all loaded up. And a lot of people, when they see this brush, they think, okay, I'm going to do this and it's going to create perfect lines. But the trick is consistency of paint. And we're going to do what I tell everyone never to do and kind of damage the brush a little bit, although it doesn't long-term damage it necessarily. I'm going to hold it and spread the bristles out. And with watercolor, I tap it off and see how much more spread out that is. Now, fur, feathers, grass, beards, hair, and you can use it two different ways. So one way, if I hold it on the side a little bit, I get a series of finer strokes on the edges, and then I get wider ones in the middle. And when we're painting animals, the lie of the fur, I say it wrong all the time. We've got sections of fur. My pens are out of juice. We've got sections of fur that overlap each other. So what we're trying to do here, there's a section. When we paint the next section, we come over top of it. And if you were using fur colors, you might layer this so that it goes dark to light or it goes light to dark. But what it does is it paints a dozen strokes in one. And what we find with painting with a liner, so there are lots of artists, even myself, who do a lot of fur and feathers with liner brushes because you get those really fine lines. The challenge with a liner, I hope I brought a liner, yeah, and not challenge in a negative way, but the thing with a liner is that you're only going to get one or two strokes at a time. Here's a liner brush, which is great, but sometimes we have a tendency to get really focused and specific when nature is often a big mess in a beautiful, beautiful way. So when I'm painting animals, I'll use a grainer or a comb first, and I'll do this, and I'll create that first section of overlay, and then I'll come in with my liner to detail. So this is a 0 liner, and let's say this was a beautiful, rich colored brown fur. And I would come over it with a lighter color of brown to overlap with a liner, a few specific strokes that are going in the direction that I want and that are highlighted in the way that I want. So this brush here is a really great way to get that under layer of strokes. It's also great for grass. And I don't paint a lot of landscapes, but when I do, you push up in little tufts and you'll get lots and lots of grass really, really quickly. One of my favorite brushes, and you know, I painted a couple of ducks the other day, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to break I had a whole kind of content plan here, but I'm going to break it for a minute. when I painted the ducks, this is a dry brush. So we'll talk about dry brushes in more detail in a minute. But with a dry brush, I actually did an underlayer of dry brushed fur feathers, sorry, came over top with a more specific layer that was lighter. I'm using the same color here, and then used a liner to highlight a couple of sections. So there's lots of different ways to kind of layer and create different effects that are going to give you depth and dimension and volume while you're painting. So that's your grainer or your comb, lots of different names. You'll notice I'm making sure I clean the brush out right away after I'm done using it. With watercolor and acrylic, you really need to do that. You don't want the paint to dry up in the ferrule here, or it will potentially spread those bristles out and split them, making them not as functional or useful as they were before. So I just saw that question, grainer or comb. Same thing. A grainer, a comb, and a rake are pretty much the same thing. Every brush company will probably name it something different, but it's the same effect. The differences will come in how far spread out those sections of the bristles are. So, and that does not have anything to do with what it's named. It's just a brand to brand will be slightly different in how much they cut it. But if you're looking for one, comb, rake, grainer, all the same. Mine is called a Philbert Comb, but any brand should probably have a variation or a version of them. One of the big differences is the Filbert Comb has kind of a rounded edge, which I prefer. The flat comb is going to be straight on the edges, which to me makes it a little bit harder to kind of get this softer edge here where I want to kind of start thinner and then spread out and move thinner. I like the Filbert shaped combs better or grainers than I do the flat ones. I hope that answered the question. I sort of saw sneak past me there.
Thank you, Willow, for all the wonderful information. This is great.
Awesome. Thank you guys for being here. Do we have an hour and a half or just an hour?
We have an hour and a half today.
Okay. So I can show a few more. That's okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
We would love that.
Awesome. Because this is fun for me. So, let's just talk about the fan brush for a minute. These are actually, you'll notice there's nothing on the handle. So this is a test brush for me, and I just pulled them out a couple days ago. We did not have a softer fan for a while, and we keep getting asked for them. It's not even released in the market yet. But if you're looking for a fan, there's synthetic fans and there's bristle fans. Bristle fans, I don't think I pulled any out, will often be lighter colored like this, and they're very stiff and they're great for oil and acrylic. Synthetic fans are softer and they're great for watercolor and acrylic. And like I said, this is a test fan. So I'm just going to show a few things. A lot of artists use them for trees, again, grass. I actually have trouble controlling them because I like to have a lot more, we'll say, I'm going to use a fake word, specificity. It's a lot more of a specific outcome. But they're great brushes. I have artists who buy our bristle fans in bulk. The bristle fans are a lot stiffer and they give a much more specific kind of mark to it. But the generic fan is great for, again, it's going to give you thin lines. I have seen a lot of artists really like them for grasses, and a lot of artists use them for the little leaves. They'll use the corner of it on trees. So that's kind of the purpose of a fan. I tend to pull out my comb, the one I showed you before this, before I pull out a fan, but I just wanted to kind of cover what the purpose of it was. Now let's talk about, I'm going to talk about trees for a minute. So something that's really interesting is sometimes we'll see a brush and we'll think it's for a specific purpose, and then we'll see it used in a new and different way and realize, wow, it's really great for something else. So we're going to flip this over and we're going to talk about our mops for a minute. Mop brushes are traditionally, they were made in either goat hair, some were made with raccoon, lots of different options. I make all of mine out of synthetic, again, with that crimped synthetic that's incredibly, incredibly fine. There's lots of different shapes and sizes of brands of mops. Sometimes you can even use them for makeup. So they're really, really cool. In watercolor, I tend to use a mini mop or a smaller mop. And I use them for trees. So I'm going to load in a little bit of my sap green here. And they're rounded and they're soft and they give me this really beautiful kind of soft, I don't know, a cloud-like effect, I guess. If I want it darker in one area while it's wet, I take that mop and I pick up a little bit of color that's not diluted. And so for me, a mop, which is often you'll find when I'm teaching, I use them in oil painting to blend my oils wet on wet. When I'm watercolor painting, I use them quite a bit for trees and whatnot. So I'm just going to show you a different way of using it. So because it's got that rounded effect, I'm using olive green this time. By pouncing instead of rouging or working in a circular motion, I get a completely different effect. And then I can pick up again that undiluted color. Let's say we need some shading. So one brush, two completely different outputs and techniques that go with it. And trees don't have to be in a perfect kind of rounded area. So let's say we have one little piece here. One over here. I'm going to start playing with color. And maybe the first layer is rounded and the second is more stippled, or this is where the most important thing we can do as artists is to play. So anytime we're taking a class, a demo, learning something new, what we're doing is we're being given a set of parameters or guidelines based on someone else's experience. The more we play with those brushes and the more we experiment and try different things, the more effect that you're going to get, that's going to show you what you're going to kind of feel comfortable with creating. Everyone's hand-eye coordination is different. Our brains all see differently. Our hands move differently. So the critical thing is that my hand naturally wants to do this. Your hand, and depending on whether or not you're left-handed, may naturally want to do this. So as you're playing with brushes and techniques, I can tell you honestly that as a teacher, years and years ago, when I worked with my mom, we were painting and glazing using Joe Sonia's paint 22 years ago. And I kept correcting something. And finally I realized that I have a style. What she was doing wasn't wrong. She was glazing with a different stroke direction than I was. And she was glazing different numbers of layers. And it wasn't that she was doing it incorrectly. It was that she was developing her own style and her own way of doing things that felt right and felt comfortable. So whatever you're learning, you want to kind of take the shape of the brush, take the knowing, okay, a round brush carries lots of water in the middle. So I'm going to get these really beautiful loose floral strokes. Then you take it from there and kind of create your own way of doing it. With watercolor, I always have I've got some clean watercolor now, a couple different ramekins. These are food ramekins. So Darren, my partner, and I are often at the lake and he'll be like, where's the salsa ramekin? I'll be like, it's on the desk, but the other 8 ramekins filled with water and paint. So there's no safe food items in this house for anyone. It's all paint supplies in some manner or another. Let's talk about trees with different brushes. Dry brushing. Dry brushes come in a million different brush brands, in a million different shapes and sizes. The trick with a dry brush is that it is capable of holding a lot of paint and allowing some of that paint to sit on the outside or the inside of it without becoming soupy. And I have to show you what I mean. It's hard to do with watercolor, but I'm just going to kind of give you an example. So any dry brush, I'm not going to thin it with water because I want a dry brush. I'm going to load it fully, and then I'm going to wipe off the excess on paper towel. So what happens is I wiped the paint off the outer edge of the brush and I left it on the inside bristles so that when I come to the surface, it does this. I was obsessed with dry brushing for years. You can dry brush the shadow on a cherry. This is obviously a green cherry or a grape. So if we have, I'm just going to show you an object and I want texture in that shadow, dry brushing is the way to go. It's a really fun way to build texture and layers and elements, and add kind of an extra bit of punch to something. So great for dry brushing. There are a million shapes of dry brushes. You can find round dry brushes. You can find dome-shaped dry brushes. You can find a million different dry brushes out there. So let's talk about something cool. So I just told you, you want not a lot of water in your brush. You want to dry brush with it, but let's say I don't want to dry brush with it. I have this brush, it's stiff, it's got a very sharp chisel edge, but a rounded moon shape, and it doesn't have a lot of snap to it. It's got good spring, because most good brushes have good spring. It'll spring right back to its shape, but it's not bendy like a round brush is. So let's take a little bit of green. I'm going to wet it, so we're not dry brushing. And again, I'm gonna make a bush. So that little moon shape on this brush makes a really cool kind of effect. The other thing with this brush, for example, if we have a dry brush, let's just do a vertical stroke in the middle. Now we have a pine tree. So depending on which brush you're using, and if I need to make that darker, I could mix a little bit of blue into my green. So amazing, amazing brushes. Dry brushes can do lots of things because of their snap, their firmness in a bristle brush. You're going to get a different way of playing with your brushes than you would with something that's going to bend really quickly on you. So if we just took a mop and we tried to do that, it would just spread out and kind of hold no shape. But when you're looking at a bristle brush, whether it's a flat, it's a round, any bristle brush, it's not going to bend as much. So you're going to have much more specific shape to it, and it's going to give you a different variety of techniques that you can complete with it, which kind of adds some dimension and some texture to the work while you're painting. And just to go to a liner for a minute, I don't have a brown out. We could mix a brown, but I'm just going to use a green. Let's say we're coming in and we're making some little lines. I like small liners. I'm a big user of like a 10-0 or a 0. You can even paint some extra little leaves and detail. I probably would have picked up burnt sienna or whatnot, but there's a liner example. And let's just show you. So this is a 0. Very nice, sharp, fine lines made with our smooth synthetic. Here's a script. I don't use a script. Lots of my students do, and lots of artists that buy brushes from us do, but they are great for this. So a script is long and it holds tons of paint and water. And it's going to give you really kind of long flowing strokes that go on and on and on and on and on. Whereas a liner is not going to carry as much water. It's going to run out sooner than a script liner will. So that's really the difference between a liner and a script liner, is the capability to carry water for a longer distance.